Wild Horse Annie, friend of the Mustangs. Annie had loved horses for as long as she could remember, especially the wild ones, Mustangs. When she was just a speck of a girl, she would sit on the rail of the corral at her family's ranch in Nevada, watching her pa tame the Mustangs that he had captured from the great herds that galloped across the desert. Annie learned to ride tucked up tight in front of Pa on the back of his trusty tamed Mustang, Old Baldy. When Pa clucked his tongue, Annie would clutch Old Baldy's bristly mane to stay on as the horse galloped through the scrub. Soon she was riding alone through the sand and sagebrush that stretched from their ranch in the Sierra Nevada mountains. She even learned to gentle wild Mustangs herself, using nothing more than a rope and her voice. But in 1923, when Annie was 11 years old, she caught polio. For a long time, she couldn't ride at all. She couldn't even walk. Annie was in a cast from her head to her hips. Day after day in a hospital far from home, she stared at a painting of a Mustang that hung on the wall outside her room. Annie liked to pretend she was riding along with that herd, fast and free and easy. When Annie left the hospital, her spine was bent and her face was twisted. Everything ached all the time. Part of Annie just wanted to hide inside her house. Instead, she got on a horse. Annie said that horse took the pain away, at least for a while. She never wanted to be without them. Annie dreamed of finding someone who loved her despite her bends and twists. Of course, that someone had to love horses too. Only slightly less than he loves me, Annie joked. She found that someone in 1936 when she met Charlie. Annie and Charlie couldn't have children of their own, but Annie wanted to live in a place where she could have horses and teach children to ride. So Annie and Charlie bought 16 acres of land hugging a curve of the Truckee River outside Reno. They called it the Double Lazy Heart Ranch. The ranch wasn't fancy, just a barn and a cabin she and Charlie had built by hand, but the Double Lazy Heart had something better than fancy. It had wild Mustangs wandering the land. By now, the great herds of Annie's childhood were gone, killed off by ranchers protecting their cattle's grazing land and hunters who sold them to slaughterhouses for use as pet food and fertilizer. But sometimes in the quiet of the morning, when the first squint of light pushed across the sky, Annie and Charlie caught a glimpse of a few Mustangs that could come down from the foothills to drink from the river. Annie and Charlie would stand on the rocks along the riverbank, still as sentinels, and then the horses would wheel and be off. Annie knew the Mustangs weren't beautiful. Most were underfed, scruffy-looking creatures, bony. They were a patchwork of colors and patterns, and they had a patchwork of history, too. The Mustangs' ancestors were domesticated horses that had arrived with early settlers who had come to live in the West. Through the years, those horses had escaped from their owners and turned wild. But no matter their backgrounds, Annie thought Mustangs were pure magic. She called them her wild ones, high-spirited, freedom-loving, and tough as barbed wire. And oh, those Mustangs moved like they had wings. Their hooves hardly touched the ground. Annie still dreamed of moving like that, flying along with the herd. One morning in 1950, as Annie was driving along a twisting gravel road, she noticed a livestock truck packed with horses. So she followed to the destination. It was a slaughterhouse. When Annie peered into the back of the truck, she saw Mustangs packed tight, all of them injured. Where did these horses come from, and why are they in such terrible condition? Annie asked the driver. He told Annie that an airplane had swooped low over the desert while men aboard fired shotguns, chasing the Mustangs into a makeshift corral. Some of the horses had been shot or trampled during the roundup, but soon they were all going to be killed. Annie had heard about these roundups, but she hadn't really thought about them. Now she couldn't stop. Annie told Charlie what she had seen. "What are we going to do now?" Charlie asked. Annie smiled. "We" was one of her favorite words. She figured that together she and Charlie could do almost anything. The very next weekend, Annie and Charlie rode their horses, Hobo and Ranger, out into the desert and found a makeshift corral. In it were 60 mustangs, fearful and sweating. Oh, they were pitiful looking, without a blade of grass to eat or a drop of water to drink. Annie and Charlie swung the gate wide, and those mustangs were gone in a thunder of hoofs and a surge of dust, and so were Annie and Charlie. But saving a few mustangs wasn't enough. Annie set up headquarters at her kitchen table. She clickety-clacked away on her typewriter, sending hundreds of letters to newspapers and politicians and neighbors and friends, telling them about the roundups and asking for help in stopping them. Charlie was her chief envelope stuffer. Soon Annie was getting threats. "You'd better lay off, sister," one person warned her. Another threatened to hang her from a tree. Some folks thought that there were too many mustangs grazing on public lands. They said the horses were nothing but varmints eating up the grass that the cattle needed. But Annie had a different opinion. She started talking in front of audiences. She worried what people might think about the bends and twists she had from polio. But in 1952, Annie learned that there was going to be a public meeting in the neighboring county about whether the government should allow another Mustang roundup. She had to go. When Annie and Charlie got to the meeting, Charlie crooned a few lines to make her feel better. He was just a lonely cowboy with a heart so brave and true. Annie knew she needed to be brave and true as well. She took a deep breath to keep her knees from knocking. And then she started telling folks about the Mustang roundups. "These horses are on public land, which makes them public property," she argued. She said that the mustangs that lived on land owned by the state or federal government belonged to all the Americans like you and me, and she insisted that they should be left alone. Annie kept typing letters. She kept speaking out. Sometimes she was in so much pain from her twisted spine that she felt like she was just held together by her girdle, but she kept speaking, and she finally got a chance to speak on television. She had her picture and her speeches in the newspapers, and people began to call her Wild Horse Annie. Annie's speech from that Senate meeting helped to convince the state of Nevada to ban the use of airplanes to capture wild horses on property owned by private citizens. That statewide ban was better than nothing, but Annie still wasn't happy. Most land in Nevada wasn't private property. It was public property owned by the state. Her Mustangs needed a law to protect them on public land, not just in one county. But how would Annie get that law passed when all the ranchers and other powerful groups were fighting so hard against her? Annie thought about her favorite word, we. "The children," Annie told Charlie. Whenever Annie had spoken about the Mustangs, the children had been eager to listen. Annie decided the children would be her secret weapon to save the horses. Annie got back to her kitchen table, and she sent letters to schools across the country telling the children about the plight of the Mustangs. And the children wrote, "Today I read your news bulletin about the wild horses. When I saw those pictures, I started crying. Please, Annie, I want to help. What can I do?" And the children began to write letters to the politicians. It started out as a trickle, and it grew into a river, and then it was an all-out flood. Thousands of children sent letters to Washington. In 1959, Congress passed a federal law that banned the use of planes and vehicles to round up Mustangs on public land. Folks called it Wild Horse Annie's Law. The law was important, but Annie knew Mustangs were still being slaughtered. They could still be rounded up and killed without using vehicles. And some people who wanted to kill the Mustangs, they just ignored the law. So Annie kept fighting for years. Most people thought Annie's dream of saving the wild horses would be impossible to achieve. "I don't think the children would like it if I quit now." So the children helped by raising money. They washed cars and they donated their money. They had bake sales and anything they could think of to make money to donate. And they wrote letters and letters and letters. Finally, in 1971, the U.S. Congress passed a broader law protecting the wild horses and burros from being captured, killed, or disturbed in any way on public land. Annie promised that if the Mustangs were endangered again, the fight will go on. She said that the Mustang represented freedom, pride, independence, endurance, and the ability to survive unbelievable odds, just like Annie.